I'm Karen Grunberg. I am faculty in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, and I'm very happy to welcome our guest speaker today, Dr. Ben Schreier. Ben Schreier teaches American literature at Pennsylvania State University, where he's professor of English and the Mitrani Family Professor of Jewish Studies. He also directs the Jewish Studies program at Penn State and is editor of the journal Studies in American Jewish Literature. He's the author of The Power of Negative Thinking, Cynicism, and the History of Modern American Literature from 2009, a critique of the dominant historicism of American literary study. His most recent book, The Impossible Jew, this is a great title, The Impossible Jew, Identity and the Reconstruction of Jewish American Literature, was published in 2015 by NYU Press. It's a daring book that engages critically with questions of Jewish identity, proposing a repositioning of Jewish studies as connected to fields such as American studies and multicultural studies. It invites increased self-critique within Jewish studies. It's gotten a little bit of heat for that, too.
I wish more.
Good heat. His talk today is titled The Rise and Fall of Jewish American Literature, A Brief World History.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Karen, for organizing this, and Galit also for all the arrangements. And thank you all for coming. I'm just wondering if I should give some introductory words, but I won't. I'll just start. So part one. My title makes an achingly oblique reference to Irving Howe's famous 1976 cultural history, World of Our Fathers, the journey of the Eastern European Jews to America and the life they found and made. And for those who don't know the book, the subtitle says it all. Though I'm actually not going to spend any time at all talking about the book today, my argument is that Howe's keyword world reveals the hegemonic legitimation of the Jewish American literary field as part of a larger institutional project to tell the history of the Jews, and as such contributes to the delegitimation of critical practices operating outside the dominion of a sort of larger legitimate sphere of ethno-historicism. But first I need to take a few steps back. So I've just finished a new book on the history of the Jewish American literary field. I argue that the field's central paradigm, ethnography essentially, has a distinct history and is in fact largely residual now. Ask anyone who cares, the dominant event of Jewish American literary history is emergence or breakthrough, right? These are in quotation marks. The eruption in the 1950s of Jewish American writers like Bernard Malamud, Philip Roth, Saul Bellow, Grace Paley, into the heart of the American cultural scene. More to the point, the fact of breakthrough is the primal scene of the primal scene of the Jewish American literary field. The more or less formalized or academically disciplined study of Jewish American literature grew up around the consolidating self-evidence of the breakthrough narrative, and the field's legibility has from the start been articulated with it. The prevailing accounts of Jewish literature in the US inevitably orbit, even if only implicitly or inconspicuously or once or twice removed, in the gravitational field of this central event. Though Jewish American literary study, unlike its brother and sister US ethnic literary formations, has mostly resisted the urge to explicitly theorize itself and its practices, the narrative of breakthrough has operated as a deputized proxy for the only real theory, however sporadically or insufficiently acknowledged, of Jewish American literature that has ever been able to carry any currency, either professionally, in the academy, or publicly among lay readers of Jewish American writing, namely immigration. Thus, if Jewish American writing before the war can be characterized by a parochial or provincial angst, dependably fitting into US literary historical departments like immigrant writing or regionalism or urban fiction, categories as durable as the dependability with which they are marked by decided second-order prestige, then within 2 decades of the war's end, it had rapidly shed these marginalizing limitations and come to represent American literature at its most central and innovative and ascendant. Accordingly, as Jewish American literary study has tended, certainly in some of its recent formations, to become more diverse in focus and more sophisticated in scope, it often draws its warrant for these critical investments from, and it reproduces an image of its own intellectual responsibility in the name of, the increasing diversity, sophistication, and independence of Jews in America. Jewish American literary study persists in imagining itself as part of the enduring historical reality of breakthrough. Significantly, in this narrative of sociocultural movement from margin to center and rearguard to leading edge, Jewish American literature dependably tracks the career of Jewish America. The breakthrough narrative of Jewish American literature normalizes itself as a straightforward and largely politically innocent reflection or representational lens, as a mode of access that suppresses critical theorization in the name of self-evident history, leveraging its hegemony on the assumption that literary history is itself neither theoretical nor historical. My new book begins in a critical suspicion about the way in which professional academic formations, including both English department-based literary study and Jewish studies-based interdisciplinarity, have taken Jewish American literature for granted, and about the way in which Jewish American literary history has itself reflected these predispositions, taking for granted its own literary historical warrant. My critical targets are the disciplinary and intellectual modes in which the Jewish American literary field's exceptionalist estrangement from the mainstream of humanistic critical self-regard have been carried out. By historicizing the practice of Jewish American literary study and destabilizing the assumption that Jewish American literary history operates entirely under the institutional authority of historical inquiry into the lives and times of Jews in America, I hope to make it easier for humanists to imagine and act on a critically self-aware intellectual practice. I certainly don't pretend that there was no institutionally housed study of writing by Jews in America before the 1950s, or that the literary intellectuals of the breakthrough, people not only like Howe, but Leslie Fiedler, Irving Malin, Daniel Walden, Alfred Kazin, Sheldon Grebstein, and Alan Gutman, for a few notable examples, invented the idea of thinking about what we now easily call Jewish American writing. To be sure, before World War II, there was fiction being written by Jews in the United States. There were scholarly works written that took as their object the representation of Jews in English and American literature. And there was, of course, the persuasive historical tradition of 19th century German Jewish Wissenschaft des Judentums, premised on the cultural nationalist logic of a trans-historical unity of Jewish expression. But scholarship could not yet take for granted the field unity of a canon of literature organized, defined, and indeed interpretable by the Jewish American identity of its authors. This was a post-war development, and it has a history that itself cannot be extracted from the gravitational pull of the breakthrough narrative. The innovation of breakthrough was not simply to link inevitably and unimpeachably the Jewish authors and Jewish texts of Jewish American literature, but to reorient thinking about literary texts written by Jews in America around authors as representatives of Jewish American people and experience. Jewish American literary study would professionalize over the following decades, as scholarly focus shifted from the object of literary representation to its subject, from Jews as a community written about to Jews as a community writing. More pointedly, the elaboration of breakthrough was often framed in triumphalist terms, if colored at times by the tragic, by critics for whom the narrative of emergence was also crucially and fundamentally bound up with a reflexive structure of self-recognition. As Leslie Fiedler, one of the leading breakthrough intellectuals, put it in a late career reflection on his writing about Jewish American literature, quote, "It was not, I realize now, a disinterested venture, since I thought of myself at the beginning of my writing career as part of the movement that had carried such children of immigrant Jews from Eastern Europe from the periphery to the center of American literary culture, making their experience, our experience, a part of the communal dream stuff, the myth that makes all Americans one, whatever their ethnic origin," unquote. And the repetition of first-person pronouns like our and us in his writing is marked. The exceptionalist insiderism that breakthrough inherited from the Wissenschaft tradition matured in post-war thinking about Jewish American literature, constituting as well a legacy for the consolidation of professional Jewish studies. The ethnic literary formations we often associate with the emergence of academic multiculturalism and ethnic studies arose from and as institutional arms of active political movements. And they still often identify themselves as part of this struggle. In its institutional interdependence with the narrative of breakthrough, however, Jewish American literary study, in a sense, emerged as part of a perception that a political struggle was in fact over. And as a result, to the extent that it continues to constitute itself as a technology for interpreting what Jews do, say, and write, Jewish American literary study reproduces the grounds of its own redundancy, if not, in fact, its own obsolescence. The cliché of Jewish American literary breakthrough was always a deputy for an albeit ambivalent foundational history of Jewish American acceptance, Indexed initially to a narrative of immigration and assimilation, in the wake of multiculturalism's ascendancy, it eventually became as well a proleptic agent for the largely successful neoconservative effort to leverage a claim of Jewish American whiteness, laboring to set Jews apart from other ethnic groups and destabilize their position vis-a-vis post-Vietnam academic thinking about ethnic identity. In this sense, we can remember one of the sort of premier quips of this neoconservative effort, which was Milton, well, I'm sure many of you have heard of this, Milton Himmelfarb's frustrated observation that though Jews earn like Episcopalians, they vote like Puerto Ricans. That is, breakthrough was a way of securing Jewish American literature in the world. If literary history is to be something other than a descriptive instrument in the toolbox of demographic accountancy, then scholars cannot take for granted the representational capacities of the word Jewish, not in the study of Jewish literature and not in Jewish studies more generally. Rather, we have to approach such use, critically interrogating it even as we unavoidably reproduce its modes and applications, as a productive act of theorizing and analysis, far more significantly than simply an act of reference or reflection. My goal in the new book has been to make legible a non-ethnographic concept of Jewish identity, one that can liberate a critically minded literary practice from an orthodoxy that takes history for granted as the fundamental scholarly discipline. Part 2. Since finishing the book, I've been pursuing some of that history's implications. Specifically, I'm interested in the affective and institutional charge of world as it relates to Jewish literature. And as I do with so many other things in our field, I approach its usage with suspicion. I come at this task from the perspective of a desire for a Jewish American epistemology that could operate outside the penumbra of a tired and played out concept of ethnicity, even as it might still claim the mantle of like Jewishiness or something. More pointedly, I hope such a practice might convince institutionally leading intellectuals operating within Jewish studies, Americanist literary studies, and American studies of the pertinence of Jewish American literature, a field that has failed for decades either to make it in an appreciable way onto the radar of mainstream English department scholarship, where it's often considered either parochial or white supremacist, even when it's not, or to circulate other than as taken for granted historical document in predominantly historicist Jewish studies scholarship, a deputy of the far more significant business of the history of the Jews. Having so far failed to make a case for the pertinence of a critically invested Jewish American literary practice, however, I have become increasingly interested in elaborating an impertinent Jewish American literary practice, one that's always articulating its own symptomaticity. One doesn't need me to point out a rather substantive institutional prejudice against critical negation and in favor of positivity and its professional seductions, that structures current academic intellectualism, perhaps especially in Jewish studies. It's one I've elsewhere diagnosed as a form of biologistic nationalism that can be usefully aligned with the conceptual gravity and self-evident metaphorical enticements of the term Zionism. Given this, I'd like to think about the enticements of thinking about Jewish writing and the world. I begin by setting out some definitions, or failing that, at least some usage notes. First, Jewish writing. Many scholars operating in or adjacent to Jewish studies or Jewish literary studies prefer to avoid offering explicit definitions of categories like Jewish literature or Jewish American literature, mostly, I suspect, because we're justifiably wary of the political pitfalls of essentialism or determinism. In the interest of interrogating our position and the institutional labors incumbent upon it, I'll venture this now. The scholarly field of Jewish literary study inheres in some sense of feedback between the recognizable Jewishness of an author and the recognizable Jewishness of a text. I'm leaving aside for now, which is of course the real issue, so one shouldn't in a sense leave it aside, but so be it, the procedures by which these recognitions are pursued and verified. I'll merely suggest that this definition in no way implies that it's the same Jewishness operating in these two linked recognitions. Second, the world. At the very least, world can mean both the world represented in a text and in which the story takes place, and also the world in which a text circulates, the world of the author, political history, literary study. Thus, we can talk at once of the world in or the worldedness of a particular text, say the Dublin of Ulysses or the Newark of Goodbye Columbus, and also the world which we, like Joyce and Roth, inhabit. This doubled meaning underlies a variety of professional scholarly practices that take for granted that our job in relating the individual work with its author and its sentences to its contexts is to index the one world to the other. Right? That's essentially what historicism is. This relation is certainly operating in Howe's title, World of Our Fathers, with the added presumption that the first person plural, which is particularly powerful in Jewish studies context, presides over the linkage. Eric Hayo suggests that we often can't avoid linking the concept of the worldedness of a text with the world through which a text circulates, and he points out, which should not come as a surprise, but it's good to keep it in mind and be careful, that professional practice almost always seeks out the form of the relation a work establishes between the world inside it and the world outside it. We assume that a kind of representational transit between the world inside a text and the world outside a text is always at least potential. A postulate, then. This presumed link or transit between the worldedness of a text and the world outside the text, and the presumed link or transit between the recognizable Jewishness of a text and the recognizable Jewishness of an author, allegorize each other. But in addition to the world inside a text and the world outside a text, there's also, perhaps more pressingly, the term world literature, a concept that, if it's going to mean anything, orients a mode of analysis whose logic necessarily exceeds the individual work, author, or sentence. Pardon the very simplified table setting, but I feel I have to do it. So Pascal Casanova has made just this relation between literature as a world and the world of literature integral to a conception of world literature, or of literature on a world scale, as she calls it. She wants to, quote, reestablish the lost bond between literature, history, and the world, while still maintaining a full sense of the irreducible singularity of literary texts, unquote. And her way of doing it is through an effort to, quote, combat the governing principle of the autonomy of the text, unquote. A project that would, quote, restore the coherence of the global structure within which texts appear, and which can only be seen by taking the route seeming farthest from them, unquote. She proposes as her key conceptual tool not a concept of world literature, that is, quote, a body of literature expanded to a world scale, unquote, but a space, which she famously designates the World Republic of Letters. Franco Moretti has famously written that, quote, world literature is not an object, it's a problem, and the problem that asks for a new critical method, and no one has ever found a method by just reading more texts, unquote. Following Heidegger and Nancy as much as Moretti and Casanova, Hayo points out that world is both a philosophical concept and an example of that concept. Following in Hayo's wake, I want to suggest that there's nothing self-evident about the literary historical use of the concept of world, and we should be particularly hesitant about using it in anything approaching a referential or indexical way. Lital Levy and Alison Schachter have devoted the last half-decade to analyzing the concept of world in the context of Jewish literary study. They have been particularly dubious about a predominating focus on terms like global, planetary, world, for their frequent reinscription of center-periphery dynamics and predisposition toward metropolitan languages. Levy and Schachter urge a shift toward the, quote, often multilingual, unquote, literature that, quote, moves along peripheral circuits, unquote. And they hope to articulate a model of world literature, even they can't avoid the term, tied to practices of translation between what they call minor or non-metropolitan languages. Quote, we are interested in the dynamics of a literary configuration that might not encompass the world, but whose transnational networks of linguistic and cultural exchange provide a clear counterpoint to the center-periphery model of global literary circulation, unquote. Jewish literature provides for them a compelling case, wait for the paradox, for the centrality of, again, minor, their term, languages to discussions of transnational literary culture. I'm going to sort of editorialize for a second here. I think it bears mentioning that their use of the term minor in what I take to be a relatively kind of reactionary and normative manner seems to be almost entirely out of step with the critical energies of what I imagine is their source text for that term, which is Deleuze and Guattari's Kafka book. And undoubtedly they get that from their shared advisor, who also, I think, misinterpreted that term in a sort of famous collection that the New Cultural Jewish Studies, Hannah Kronfeld's essay in that collection, which I think also like radically misunderstood that term. But this is a line of argument they continue in their introduction to the special issue of proof texts, which is, for those who don't know it, sort of the major journal of Jewish literary history, not American, just all Jewish literary history, on Jewish literature and world literature. That's a special issue they edited 2 years later, where they reiterate their concept of world literature. Quote, in particular, its intersection with post-colonial literary theory, unquote, which offers, quote, a way to break down normative structure and categories such as Yiddish literature, Mizrahi literature, and Hebrew literature, unquote, on its way to enabling a characterization of modern Jewish literature as marked by what they call the non-universal global. That's their sort of keyword. The literature, quote, of a global diaspora that is cosmopolitan, yet is everywhere marked by its minority status, unquote. My concern with this approach is not simply that their continued reliance on a structuring metaphorology of centrality suggests a fundamental failure of the counter-normative intent of their project. For all its revisionary intention, I suspect that in their approach, Jewishness, and again, this is portrayed by their like nationalized renormalization of Deleuze and Guattari's term minor, remains the perversely unmarked center of a national project to claim the representational privilege of relevance. Accordingly, I also suspect that a critical term like the world is in fact symptomatic for Jewish American literary study of an anxiety about relevance that can be traced back to the breakthrough narrative. It's an anxiety that has its roots in the Jewish literary field's foundational assumption that literary documents are primarily significant for what they tell us about the people always understood as members of populations who wrote them. Indeed, the texts exist primarily as biopolitical figures of populations, or figures for populations. Part 3. So let's set a baseline. I was recently teaching E.L. Doctorow's 1971 book, The Book of Daniel, which is great for those of you who haven't read it. And I realized the book offers a compelling way to orient a discussion of the world. The novel's fictionalization of the Rosenberg affair, here perpetrated on Rochelle and Paul Isaacson and their children, especially as couched in a meditation on the terms of the persuasiveness of a political heritage, along with its tendentious dramatization of the shift from a hierarchical and corrupted old left systematization of politics to a devolved and democratic new left imagination of political engagement, represents precisely the affective and analytical pull of relevance signified by the term world. The novel explicitly uses the term world early on in narrating the linked stories of Susan and Daniel Lewin, née Isaacson, the novel's fictionalized rendering of the orphaned Rosenberg kids, growing up as adoptees in the Lewin household. Lewin in the book is the lawyer who sort of takes on the Rosenberg kids after the Isaacsons, after the Isaacsons are first put into jail and then killed, put to death, whatever the term is, when the state does it. In narrating the linked stories of Susan and Daniel Lewin, growing up as adoptees in the Lewin household, growing into, quote, the indolent rituals of the teenage middle class, unquote, and growing out of a sense of obligation to, quote, live in faith and memorial to the people who had betrayed you, unquote. Narratively centered on Daniel Isaacson, who's the older kid, the son, the novel tells us, quote, it seemed so easy to break free because it was what the world wanted of you. The world wanted you to forget who you had been and what had happened to you. The world did not want to visit the sins of the fathers. If, in their proud, snotty, tormented adolescence, he and his sister tacitly came to the conclusion that Paul and Rochelle Isaacson were not worth their loyalty, there was, however, nothing they could do to squander it. The decision was out of their hands. Whatever they did, whatever view they took, it was merely historical process operating. And even faithlessness in their hearts, real, genuine, bitter brewed carelessness of spirit, could not dissolve that, unquote. Here, world, deployed, however, ironically, refers to something bigger, a frame more significant than the individual or domestic. If Daniel is cynical in this moment, the bitter apathy he's here describing will be overcome in time in a savvy ethical engagement. There's nothing ironic about the compelling power invested in the term world. The world bears scale, and that scale is authoritative. This is a sense emphasized a bit later when Susan, the younger child, tries to convince Daniel of the importance of establishing a foundation that supports political activism to be named after their executed parents. The Paul and Rochelle Isaacson Foundation for Revolution, which for her would indicate is her word, quote, the proper assumption of their legacy, unquote, as the children of the Isaacsons. When Daniel, still cynically, asks to whom such a foundation would indicate this, Susan answers, quote, "Why, to the world," unquote. To Daniel's snarky resistance, Susan bitterly tells Daniel, quote, to forget the foundation, which doesn't need you, unquote, and go back to his dissertation research. He's ostensibly trying to write a dissertation in history. Quote, "Go back to the stacks, Daniel. The world needs another graduate student," unquote. Again, world here signifies at its most general importance, significance, relevance, considered as the objective superseding the merely personal. Which I sense, I guess, the understanding is that writing a dissertation is merely self-indulgence. The book drops the irony and sarcasm when Daniel heads downtown to pay a visit to Artie Sternlicht, the novel's new left paragon, kind of like Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, mixed with a touch of Allen Ginsberg. He discovers that, quote, "Avenue B is humming. Cars coming through the narrow street. People are out. Cars come through the narrow street. People are out on a hot night. 2 blocks away is the park at Tompkins Square, and from it emanates a pulse of energy composed of music and shouting and the heat of many people. The world comes to America down Avenue B," unquote. A few lines later, Daniel, quote, "suddenly sees the Lower East Side with Sternlicht's vision. It is a hatchery, a fish and wildlife preserve," unquote. It's a perspective that, enacting the very observation, administers Daniel's political awakening out of nihilistic cynicism. Indeed, Daniel will soon embrace the revolutionary optimism of Sternlicht's insistence that, quote, "everything is significant, every small act changes the world," unquote. My point here is not to discuss Doctorow's novel at length, but instead to illustrate how, rather than a simple referential term, world is an ideological machine that operates within an ethical epistemological practice of justification. More than simply meaning something definite, world stages an argument. A second data point. The chief signifying lever for 9-year-old Philip Roth, narrator and protagonist of author Philip Roth's novel The Plot Against America, is the void between the provincial and the world. The entirety of his child's experienced world, at least before the advent of the American berserk's nativist fascism, orbits in the small Jewish enclave of Weequahic in Newark. Everything around him is Jewish and safe, and he has no reason to think anything could be otherwise until the Republican Party nominates for president Charles Lindbergh, quote, "the bigot who had denounced Jews over the airwaves to a national audience as other peoples, employing their enormous influence to lead our country to destruction, rather than truthfully acknowledging us to be a small minority of citizens vastly outnumbered by our Christian countrymen," unquote. Along with the disruptive transvaluation of the hierarchical opposition between in and out, we used to be in Weequahic with everyone else out. Now we are being labeled the other peoples who do not quite belong in the citizenry of the United States. Young Philip Roth comes to understand and confront the fact of a world larger than the protected domestic confines of his family and of his own naive comprehension. We might therefore want to map the world onto the anxiety marked in young Philip Roth's shock of recognition in being cast as an other, standing in opposition to the us that is presumably available to the state speaker endowed with the power to designate other peoples. It's easy to read Roth's novel as an allegory of cosmopolitan maturation. To become intellectually and ethically mature is to recognize one's proximity to and implication with otherness. In a sense, the fascism of Lindbergh's America First social programs is nothing more than the dark rightist flip side of the compassionate care of Jewish Newark and its unimpeachable synecdoche, the unfailingly supportive Roth household. Just as young Philip is forced to contend with the intrusion into the domestic of the other, economic hardship, the threat of the unknown, physical violence, even goyim, so America's liberal stability is forced to contend with the destabilizing emergence of illiberality. Both the Roths and liberal America as a whole ultimately persevere, but the Roths at least show the cosmopolitan marks of struggle as their filial order is forced to realign around routines of care that temporarily embrace their ex-neighbor Sheldon Wishnow, the orphan victim of anti-Semitic violence. As Philip outgrows his sheltered naivete on the way toward developing mature intelligence, so America outgrows the seductions of narrow ethno-nationalism on its way toward developing a worldly liberal patriotism. In fact, one could suggest that a preoccupation with the world, that is, an embrace of all its attendant anxieties, has always already functioned as one of the key shibboleths of the breakthrough structured Jewish American literary field. that simultaneously academic and para-academic pursuit that has, from its birth, been obsessed with the relation of Jews to the world outside their narrow cultural confines. As it institutionalized itself during the years of the breakthrough of writers like Roth, Bellow, Malmuth, and Paley in the 50s, Jewish American literary study was as focused on writers of the earlier generations, Abraham Kahan, Henry Roth, Samuel Ornitz, Mary Antin, for some examples, who made assimilation of a Jewishness marked as foreign into American society an object of literary value, as it was on the breakthrough writers themselves, who made Jewish difference itself the very vehicle and keynote of American cultural achievement. And in the years to follow, successive efforts at institutional expansion, initially the recovery efforts beginning in earnest in the 1970s to bring women writers into the Jewish American literary canon, followed by ongoing projects to bring first Russian and then non-Ashkenazi writers into the institutional fold, further intensified the field's productive reinscriptive displacement of a worry about the world beyond the provincial stability of the already recognized. Far from indicting Jewish American literature for any putative blindness or ideological self-deception on this score, however, my interest instead is in focusing on and amplifying those moments when the Jewish American literary tradition can be seen to be critically self-aware of precisely this constitutive anxiety. And so here, Schadenfreude be damned, I want to conclude with Jonathan Safran Foer's 2016 Here I Am, a novel as fascinated with the disruptively productive prospect of other worlds as it is with the Jewish American literary tradition and its relation to it, the latter as figured most conspicuously in the synecdoche of Philip Roth, and most intensively in the fact that the central character won the National Jewish Book Award at the age of 24, like Foer himself. Here I Am co-locates the dissolution of the suburban Washington, D.C. family headed by Julia and Jacob Bloch, with sons Sam, Max, and Benji, Jacob's parents Irving and Deborah, and Jacob's grandfather Isaac, with the threatened dissolution of the State of Israel, inaugurated by a devastating earthquake that quickly leads to a pan-Levantine war. The unassimilable possibility of other worlds, actualized or only latent, proliferates throughout the text, precisely as juxtaposed with normative worlds. For starters, there's the online platform all of the novels adolescents and young adults inhabit called Other Life, which we're told is in fact not a game. It's a community rather than a game, Jacob's second son Max insists. The theme repeats in the novel's emphasis, never subtle, on the opposition between Israel and the US, especially as it bears on the unsatisfyingly unresolvable problem of Jewish American identity. In the not unrelated return to the idea of bomb shelters versus the outside world, on impersonation, on flirtation and the threat of actual infidelity, on model UN, and on creation, the Bereshis. Rather than allowing us to stage an argument about a wider worldly significance of Jewish American literature, however, Here I Am, in its relentlessness with imagining the overdetermined juxtaposition of particularity and its others, figures the desire for representational worldliness. Unsurprisingly, the novel substantiates this figuration through a fixation on representation, specifically via questions about how Jews, Jewishness, and Jewish experience are to be represented. Sam, Jacob and Julia's oldest son, ostensibly preparing for his imminent bar mitzvah, imagines a synagogue whose largest stained glass window features, quote, an ongoing depiction of the Jewish present. That's capitalized. So instead of learning the idiotic and utterly useless Ashrei, he wrote a script that pulled keywords from a Jewish-related Google News, this is like perfect Jonathan Safran Foer, that pulled keywords from a Jewish-related Google News feed, ran them through a jury-rigged video search, which combed out redundancies, red herrings, and anti-Semitic propaganda, ran those results through a jury-rigged video filter, which scaled the images to best conform to the round frame and color-adjusted for continuity, and projected them onto the window. It was better in his head than in reality, but everything was, unquote. Another world. Not at the end of the day so dissimilarly, Julia, we're told, quote, hated the person Jacob forced her to sound like, pissy and aggrieved, unfun, the nagging wife she would have killed herself to avoid becoming, unquote. The book is not flattering to the wife. Almost everybody in this book is ironically related to themselves, forced to navigate, though maybe not adjudicate, between who they feel like and how they appear to others and to themselves. The book is finally preoccupied with the Hineni, Here I Am, as foundational a gesture in Judaism as we're likely to find, to which it returns repeatedly. Here I am, or I am here, what Abraham and Moses both intone when addressed by Hashem, is also the novel's response to alternatives. It neither transcends nor bridges nor decides between, but rather holds onto, in suspension, the oppositions and choices that proliferate here. Israel and America, Zion and diaspora, marriage and affair, real life and other life, original and copy, world and imagination. These pairs are ultimately unresolvable, unordered, and not hierarchized in the novel's archive. Rather than being frustrating, the novel seems to propose that this dwelling amid alternatives not only embraces cosmopolitan maturity, but also that it is the principle of identity. When eldest son Sam crushes his hand in the car door as a young child, Julia does not say, "It'll be okay," a throwaway line that ignores the reality of pain, but instead, quote, "I love you and I'm here," unquote, which acknowledges both his pain and her comforting presence, and is, whatever else it might be, true. The Hineni later becomes a figure for patriarch Jacob's wrestling with an angel. Israel, we're told, means not loves God or reveres God or even obeys God, but wrestles God, the fundamental condition of which is closeness, explains second son Max in his bar mitzvah speech. Quote, "You only get to keep what you refuse to let go of," unquote. There's not one bar mitzvah speech in this book, but two. Lest you think Foer's novel Here I Am is disinterested or abstract in its explorations of Jewish thought, the kind of wrestling the book is really interested in is the wrestling with the Jewish literary tradition. Podcast listening and former National Jewish Book Award-winning Jacob is a writer for TV now, but his father, Irving, the conservative Zionist to Jacob's liberal diasporist, despite the fact that he would never dream of actually living in Israel, wants him to, quote, "write something that matters," which presumably for him means something that'll help Israel in its epochal conflict with the Arabs. Israeli military superiority, somehow a figure for Jewish identitarian self-evidence. With martial, if septuagenarian, self-satisfaction, he insists that, quote, "a Jewish fist can do more than masturbate and hold a pen," unquote. I count oblique references to no fewer than 4 Philip Roth novels throughout the book. Indeed, on the same page as this citation of Portnoy's complaint, or at least to its sensation, is a potential reference to Operation Shylock, specifically the possibility of a Jewish-American writer spying for Israel. And I see as well allusions to The Counterlife, specifically to its Kahanist settler Mordecai Lippmann, and Sabbath's Theater, specifically to Sabbath's Walk Through the Cemetery. Anyone who's read Jonathan Safran Foer doesn't need me to point out his pomposity, but I do think that the book's repeated "Here I Am" does more than simply and presumptuously claim Foer's presence amid Jewish American literature's pantheon of greats. When someone says, "I am here," they are necessarily making and occupying a world that always includes others. And concomitantly, the experience of worlded meaning in this book demands of humans that they claim the Hineni. This presents another way to approach the kind of anxiety that underlies a certain kind of attention to the world and world literature in Jewish literary study. Perhaps especially in this sense, another dyad of linked terms in this novel is Holocaust and Zionism. It's not only arrogant Irv, for whom to be Jewish is always potentially to be a victim of the Holocaust. And for whatever else we can say, this conjunction is one of the legacies of the post-war Americanization of the Holocaust. In its biopolitical insistence on Jewish survival, in its yoking of Jewish life to Jewish identity, the Holocaust serves as justification for actually existing Zionism. That is, as whatever else it might be, is whatever else it might want to be other than a militarized nationalism, despite whatever other phantasmatic attractions that liberal Zionists might imaginatively invest for themselves. This is the kind of world I'm interested in thinking about, not how texts represent or access a wider world of presumed and taken for granted actuality, but how critical disciplinarity can expose how worlds are never quite available for representational access. Thank you.
Tell us the title of the book, which I egregiously left off.
Oh, well, it's not. I mean, it's only being considered for publication right now, but it's The Rise and Fall of Jewish American Literature is the main title, and the subtitle might change depending on what people say. Sure. I don't think I told you what, so it was not your. Yeah.
I had 2
questions, but they may come from me like furiously trying to get things written down and not getting it right. But thank you. I really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
So you made a couple of points that I wondered if you might clarify. And again,
Sure.
if I just got them wrong. One was you spoke about trying to come up with a non-ethnographic concept of Jewish American identity, which, as I'm saying that, maybe you mean that related also to your point about
Literature,
apart from-
Jewish American literature. Sorry.
Jewish American literature, okay. But yeah, you also said something about picking it apart from ethnic studies too. So yeah, I was actually wondering if you could say more about what you mean by a non-ethnographic concept of Jewish American.
Sure. So very simply, all I mean is that Jewish American literary study should not necessarily understand itself only as the study of Jewish Americans, right? As engaged in a kind of ethnography, right? We've got Jewish American history. We don't need Jewish American literary study to replicate the disciplinary mandate of Jewish American history.
Okay.
That's the simple answer. And as for the ethnic studies stuff, like I feel that at least for the last 20 or 30 years at this point, lots of ethnic studies fields have been going through a fairly sophisticated kind of theoretical self-critique. Trying to understand how they fit together, right? Jewish studies, I think, and when I talk about sort of professional Jewish studies, I mostly am talking about the AJS, the Association for Jewish Studies. But I think they're very happy to sort of tout the kind of their interdisciplinarity, right? What I don't think professional Jewish studies is so happy to do is think about how all of those disciplines fit together, right? And so presumably there's some kind of concept of Jewish identity that allows a Jewish studies anthropologist and a Jewish studies rabbinicist and a Jewish studies literary person to all have a conversation together, right? But I think I think professional Jewish studies has not dedicated itself to turning that interdisciplinarity on itself and to like mount a really sustained critique of the concept of identity that holds itself together, that holds the project together. That's what I mean. So I think I don't want some concept of ethnic identity to be the kind of ultimate guarantor of Jewish literary study, but ethnic studies as a academic formation, I think, has a lot to teach Jewish studies.
One of the things that seems like ethnic literature studies and ethnic studies has gone through in terms of its own critique is a critique of the kind of heteronormativity and singularity of the voice of
Yes.
ethnic male literature. But in your discussion of Jewish American literature, you still seem to be, I heard you mention Sephardic and women vaguely, but don't talk about it at all. It seems still to be very Ashkenazic, male, heteronormative centered, when there's been a huge proliferation
Sure.
of women writers, gay writers, etc.
Well, in my defense, I talk about 3 writers. So I'm not making any sort of pretension to be whatever, but comprehensive. But I also, in my other book too, The Impossible Jew, my point is that I'm trying to critique normative disciplinary practices from inside. And so those normative practices have been based on entirely Ashkenazi, like the field grew up entirely around Ashkenazi writers, mostly male writers, and as commented on by male Ashkenazi critics. So I'm all for other forms of critique. My critique is a critical one from within it, just looking at how it created. So I did not mean to suppress those other possibilities of those other avenues.
Are you saying that there isn't a a queer critique within the Jewish American literature? I mean, there certainly is.
No, sure.
Jewish studies.
Yeah. Sure, there is. I'm just looking at the patterns of disciplinary, the entirely articulated patterns of disciplinary canon information.
Got it.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be hostile. I agree with what you're saying. That's not what I'm doing, but I embrace it.
My question relates to both of these, and I think this is kind of what you're saying about where other ethnic literature fields have been, and also African American writers,
Yeah, absolutely.
writers. It seems to me that each of these literatures goes through, and people and critics writing about them go through an important moment in African American literature. It's been not necessarily differentiating from history, but from sociology.
Yeah.
We are not representing Black life to be studied by sociologists. We're doing something specifically literary.
Yeah.
And, and in a way, this might be a huge overgeneralization, but in a way, it's done in relation to a breakout moment like the Harlem Renaissance or the Native Renaissance in the 70s or the Chicano Renaissance. And so then, people looking back on that at whatever distance are saying, and part of what they're saying is this was a heteronormative male movement. And it was also a movement that bought into the idea of representativeness, that we're trying to represent a people. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more specifically, comparatively, about, I thought I was really interested when you pointed out there isn't this same impetus of an ongoing political movement for Jewish American literature.
Right. They're trying, I feel like people are trying to make that case after the fact a little bit now, but yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I just wondered if you could talk a little bit comparatively about
Right.
how you see these. Are they, very broadly speaking, the same kinds of what you're calling for would be the same kind of movement that happened in these other disciplines, but it just would be belated later, or did it have to happen differently within Jewish?
No, I don't think it has to happen differently. I'm really trying to avoid any kind of exceptionalist argument about Jewish studies, that it somehow is necessarily different from the other fields. I think one of the things that differentiates Jewish studies and Jewish literature in particular from the other ethnic groups, the other ethnic movements, is that, again, Jewish literature started having its breakout moment when Jewish Americans were already reaping so many more benefits from American society than the other ethnic groups could have ever dreamed of, right? And again, that was my very rushed argument about neoconservatism, that they're trying to there was a real effort, implicit, I guess, effort to leverage Jewish American whiteness, so that Jews could be accepted, and so this is the literature of, and so it was and here's my answer to your other question. We're going to market Jewish difference, but it's a Jewish difference that's kind of epiphenomenal, right? It's not real difference because we're really white, unlike you Latinos and blacks. So about your breakout moments, I think that's super shrewd observation that all of these literary movements are articulated with these kind of breakout moments, right? But all of those breakout moments are what they really are. They're market events, right? They're moments at which this literature could be identified as a kind of coherent body and could be sold by publishers, right? And this is something I'm improvising about right now, but so when a body of literature is both identified as a body of literature and sold as representative of a kind of a population, right? Of a kind of coherent body of experience, necessarily that representativity is built into that calculation, right? So it's being sold as this African American literature is being sold as representative of the African American experience that we have not we, i.e. white Americans, have not heretofore had an opportunity to understand. Chicano literature, right, is being sold as a kind of accessible representation of Chicano experience, again, that we have not otherwise up to this point had an opportunity to understand. So I think they're all, and so same with the Jewish literary breakthrough, that's also being sold, right? Publishers could figure out that they could sell lots of books written by Jews starting in the 50s, right? So I think.
Just two super quick follow-ups, if that's all right. Yeah, those are great answers to my question. Just one is, I'm just interested in your title, The Rise and Fall, because it seems a title that's so much in the vein of American literature, the rise of
Right.
And I mean, that whole idea of the rise narrative, it's so quintessentially American. So I just wondered, what kind of resonance that you were setting up with that sort of American literary trope of the rise.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't thinking self-consciously about it, but I was looking for a catchy title.
Yeah, I understand it. Yeah, and then the other one is, do you know this book by Kenneth Warren, What Was?
Yes,
Yeah.
super important to
Yeah, I figured you know. Yeah.
what was African American
What was
literature.
African American literature?
And so his argument is basically that what we think of as African American literature was in fact a kind of Jim Crow phenomenon.
And in a way, it's that we no longer need African American.
Right, exactly.
literature, because now, not that we're white, but now we're not suffering under Jim Crow.
It was a series of lectures at Harvard that I think 2005 maybe, 2003, something early 2000s.
This may be obvious, but I think I heard you say that Jewish American literature is not yet integrated into the American literature canon, in other words, as taught by English departments in a survey course or something.
Yeah, not exactly. I mean, I think there will be like one, if you were to take like a post-Civil War survey, Goodbye Columbus, something would be a Abraham Khan. There would be something. What I mean is that ask any like, sort of relatively comprehensive English department faculty in America. Jewish American literature is not like, Jewish literature is not a hiring priority. And I mean it more than that. I mean, and not even that it should be. I mean, whatever. But like the way in which they conceptualize literary importance has a lot to do with identity. I mean, women's literature is probably less of a priority now than it used to be, but like certainly queer or gay and lesbian literature is something. Still lots of kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic literature, like Latina. Everybody wants, one, if not more than one, ethnic literature specialist, and sometimes several of each category, right, of ethnic. And so the issue is that Jewishness doesn't count as that kind of identity anymore, right? Like, no one is going to say, right, that was another unelaborated part of when I mentioned the kind of white supremacist part. Like, I literally, I think Jewish, like, Roth, Bellow, these are considered white writers and part of the kind of canon that needs to be destabilized now, right? That's what I mean.
Do you, speaking of worlds, how much emphasis do you put on Americans writing in Hebrew or in Yiddish?
This is something about which I know like so little, and I should know more. Like this is my project is an English language project, and I think that the idea of specifically American writers, not the idea, the phenomenon of American writers writing in non-American language, right, and writing in Hebrew, writing in Yiddish. Well, that's the thing. I mean, no, but these are like great questions. Like, I think these are super important questions.
If you name the world, postulate that being sort of the normative transit with all the whether you're in or out. I think that that's an important
Yes.
subtext of defining sort of American, whether it's identity or literature.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think that's a great point. I don't have anything more to say about that, but I think it's a great point. Unfortunately, very few people work on specifically American Hebrew writing, and that which does exist operates in, I think, like a fairly non-critical, like kind of neoclassicist sort of project that I think is not very useful to what I'm trying to do. But yes.
Well, I just think it's interesting, and when you speak of sort of the whiteness and the destabilization, I think that actually has a lot of force.
Yeah.
To inform.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other question I'm interested in, I'm really interested in these questions of definition and defining Jewish writing or Jewish American writing. And I'm especially interested in the phenomenon of writers who are not necessarily considered among writers who are Jewish but are not considered Jewish writers, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. That's my next project, by the way. Seriously. I wanted to call it dubiously Jewish writing.
Yeah, or just, Jew-esque, as my friend used to.
Jew-esque. Is that related to Jewess?
And not even just, but sort of sometimes identifiably, right, and I guess it's partly related to the possibility of Jews passing, or some Jews passing, as white or as non-Jewish. And I just wonder if you, it's a selfish question because I'm writing about a Jewish writer who had changed their name from their Jewish name to a non-Jewish sounding name.
Imagine.
Yeah, who would do that? But sometimes wrote in Jewish journals and on Jewish subjects. But what does that mean to go in and out of Jewishness as a writer?
Right. I think that's great. I don't have that much to say about it, but so the kind of two texts that have gotten me to think about this new project on dubiously Jewish writing are first Steingart's latest book, The Lake Success, which is still pretty Jewy, but it's really good. But it's also it was kind of the way a lot of the reviews presented it was like, this isn't as Jewy as like Absurdistan or something like that, right? So that would be like the kind of text that's like, it's like the central character is a Jew, but knows less about Judaism than like his non-Jewish wife, that kind of stuff. So that would be like the kind of text that's written by a Jew. But then there's also like Howard Fast or something. There's like lots of examples of these like, writers who are like, they exist as like Jews. They're like popular, but they're not Jewish writers, right?
But he wrote.
But although he did write them,
But
yeah.
he wrote some book that I was given by the Hebrew School Brotherhood or whatever. Wait, what is it? In My Glorious Brothers.
Yeah, something like that, right?
Something.
No, he did write some, or even like blanking Cain Mutiny, Herman Woke,
Yeah.
Although he also wrote some Jewish books.
Right,
No.
right, yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm more.
Right.
These people who wrote it, like maybe they're one Jewish book. Or,
Right. And then the other thing was, I'm also, I've just recently read Asymmetry. Has anybody read this book? Not by a Jew. Halliday, Lisa Halliday, is that her name?
Yeah.
Lisa Halliday, which is this super interesting book, but she herself had a relationship, when she was a 20-some-odd-year-old editorial assistant, she had a relationship with Philip Roth, and the first half of the book is about a young editorial assistant who has an affair with a Jewish writer. But she is not Jewish, but it's like very much, and like in that first half of the book, it's very much like she does a very good job of kind of replicating that world of Jewish writing, so. Anyway, all I can say is I think it's a great question.
Okay,
Can I
good, I'm getting a good list here.
Doesn't this argue for an exceptionalism? In the sense that if you're a black writer, a Latino writer, there have been so many Jewish writers that move in and out since the teens and the 20s. Nathaniel West is an example, but many more.
Mm-hmm.
That because of the participation of Jews in the literary world, whether they're writing about Jews or not Jews or Jewish situations, it's so much more normalized than the African-American writer or the Latino writer that it creates a different situation for literary critics.
Right.
I find what you say very interesting, but I'm not sure who has to learn from whom.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say like an African-American writer doesn't have that much to learn from a Jewish writer who's accepted as white by, like the African-American experience. It's not the African-American writer's fault that he's treated differently than,
Right.
But so I would say that the more interesting, I think more productive discussion can be had, not about what makes Jews and Jewish writers different than African American and Latino writers, but why, the more interesting discussion can take place around why American racialism has treated Jews differently than it's treated African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans. I mean, so it's not, for me, exceptionalism is like an identitarian term. It's about what makes these people different. I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is that America has treated them differently. And that seems to be the more productive discussion to have. Like the more productive critique can take place there. American racism is a fascinating phenomenon. You heard it here first. I mean, it's so interesting how it racializes people.
Do you see any American Jewish writers or whatever you want to, however your definition is, self-consciously going the other way and writing more about alterity than trying to be accepted as white?
Oh, yeah, sure. No, I mean, I think now, I mean, that's sort of what I'm saying is like the breakthrough was premised on that. Was like Philip Roth made his name by exploring Jewish eccentricity. I mean, I think.
But in a bigger context of, I think, the majority culture, you see others.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think there's certainly a market now and these are writers that I don't know that much about, I haven't read that much, but I think like now the kinds of writers that there's lots of buzz around are not Ashkenazi white writers. They're Latino, they have Latino heritage, they have there's I think that there's a lot of interest in exploring writers who either can't or don't want to identify as white.
Oh, sure, but in the survey that you're saying, somebody like in the music world,
Oh,
who spoke specifically as an other.
Right.
Is there anybody in that survey outside of where we are currently who you might have?
Yeah, no, I mean, I hope I tried to I'm sorry, maybe this wasn't that clear. Like, I'm not making arguments about the literature. I'm making arguments about how the discipline has treated literature. I think you can find fascinating arguments inside. I mean, all of these texts, as was pointed out, they're all by, white Ashkenazi male writers, but they're full of these explosively disruptive moments. So yes, I mean, I'm not in the business of categorizing writers. Like that's not my interest. I'm interested in shining a critical reflection back on the discipline.
So on the one hand, you're saying that the crux of the question is how has America treated these writers?
That was just in response to that. I mean, that's,
Okay.
yeah.
Because
The crux of my question is how the field has
Right,
treated the
okay,
writers.
So that's what, so then you said earlier in the talk something, and I might be getting this slightly off, but something about how the Jewish writers have a kind of, there's an obsession with the way the Jews relate to the world outside, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, as the field, yes. I feel, I'm sorry, I'll finish.
I want to make sure I'm getting it.
Just that when the field when the field of Jewish American literary study was kind of cohering in the 50s and mostly 60s, right? It was always thinking about, again, like with the pre-breakthrough writers, like it was all like the what all of these intellectuals like Howe and Kazin, they were always pointing at like these kind of dramas of assimilation and immigration and assimilation, and like how, the whole like cliche of second generation forgetting the first generation, and then the third generation wanting to
So
kind
that
of
was
like
the subject
de-assimilate.
matter of this literature, but then you weren't, but then.
But
there
they
was also
emphasized,
critics.
they were, well, but that's the thing, they made the literature into a drama of Jews as a minority population relating to the majority population around them. That's what I mean. So like that kind of tension between a minoritarian insiderism and a kind of hegemonic culture was always part of the way the field understood itself.
Yeah, I was just trying to sort of make a distinction in my own mind as I was listening to you between that on the one hand and the kind of thing you mentioned, Roth, and I was thinking about Portnoy's complaint and the reception to Portnoy's complaint. Like there are certain expectations
Yeah.
of a Jewish American author, right? You can't air our dirty laundry, you can't. So even when you're being really introspective and really sort of thinking about what it means to be Jewish in America on your own terms, then that's something that maybe Jewish readers would, or Jewish critics might take you to task for.
Well, yeah. I mean, Roth, of course, made his career on upending that expectation, which was the case for an earlier generation, I think, of writers. But yeah.
Right, and shining a light on it.
Yeah, exactly. Like the dirty laundry is what sells the books. And Bellow and stuff.
Speaking of a market event, the breakout, who was the early readership of?
That's a great question, and I have not done that work. What I do know is that these were, well, like, I know Knopf wasn't Jewish owner, or there was someone I know is working on this, of the publication history. The readership, I mean, Random House was publishing a lot of these, Penguin was publishing a lot of these, so those were, they're not, for them to sell books means a lot of people are buying them. So I think the readership, the whole point of the breakthrough was that these were like crossover books that
Right.
that a wide selection of readers were
We
buying.
even had in television, like the Goldberg.
Yeah, exactly.
So it wasn't a nucleus of Jewish readers, and then
I don't think so.
It
I
sounds
do,
like
but
it jumped over that.
well, I think
Ran
early.
into the general market.
Yeah, this is stuff that I have not. This is work that I have not done. Which I know someone who's working on it now. But yeah, it's a really important question. That's related to that kind of stuff.
The harassment that Philip Roth got, I wondered if they had actually read the book. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think a lot of the hate mail that he got was by parishioners. They would probably not read it. Who knows if the rabbis did either, who were sending him poison pen letters.
Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, was there?
I think, was there another question? Or we can also continue the conversation however you want.
Well, I'm not in the field now, but it seems to me that if you look at the modern Jewish writers from Russia,
Mm-hmm.
they would have less of a problem being Jewish because
You mean the writers now, like
Now.
Fishman, Steingart, those people? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Because there's not much Jewish that they bring.
It's kind of like a DIY Jewishness.
They're white.
Yeah.
And so you don't have that distinction between white African American and Latino.
Right.
I mean, they're
They
white.
no, and that's super interesting. Yeah, that I can't speak to. I mean, I do know, like, they are certainly not speaking. Like, there's no presumption that they're representative. They're speaking for Jewishness. Like, Fishman, Steingart, like these writers are very. I mean, because it's like they had bits and pieces of Jewishness. Half of it was heritage that like they don't understand. Yeah, and they're kind of like making, and they're sort of there. It's like a drama from like within Jewishness, but they're also, it's always about an experience. Like they're all like certainly the early novels by these writers. They're all experiencing American Jewishness. Like what the hell is this? Like they don't know what it is. So and it's like an outsider's tale about the encounter with Jewishness, but from inside. You know, it's interesting.
I may have lost the connection between that you're trying to make about the critique of your field. But it does seem to me that, you know, when you're talking about the difference between, let's say, the acceptance of Jewish writers and African-American writers, is that, you know, people like my parents' generation, my father, they fought that war and World War II against the Holocaust. And when they came back, that was what the country had fought for. It was perceived, and Bob has written books on this, it was perceived of what that war was about. So after that war, I think that there was an acceptance in this country that that was a war that was worth fighting. It was not, the war wasn't fought for African Americans. I think the Jews.
No, that was the Civil War, which didn't change anything.
Yeah, we didn't get a good.
Well, but again, that's my point, that it's not about the Jews or the African Americans. It's about how American society has treated the Jews or the African Americans.
Right, but I guess that's the first point I'd make. And then the second point is that, you know, with this breakthrough moment in Jewish literature, to a certain extent, there's a generational thing, that, like my generation, is that they almost had to, like mentioning at the beginning, Irving Howe, like the New Left took him on.
Right.
Because his paradigm and everything for social change was, you know, to a certain extent pre-war. And after the war, you know, people on the left and Jews in school, like when I went to school, the issue wasn't so much class conflict. You were defining things in terms of bureaucracies. And you were accepting a new kind of paradigm. And you were taking on these bureaucracies in the war in Vietnam, for instance, not just as a Jew, but also as an American. That was really an American war.
Right. And that, like, Howe couldn't figure that out. Like, you're saying that, like, someone like Howe couldn't navigate that, like, new conceptualization of like social conflict?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I don't think it was hard for him to have that discussion because his ideological bent was really.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think that's true. I think there's part of that is true. I mean, you know, it's interesting for this guy who, like, founded Dissent, which is a fairly significant socialist magazine in the 50s, was being pilloried in the, 15, 20 years later in the late 60s by, the New Left for not getting it. And it's, what's that?
Pot horse.
Yeah, well, that's a different thing too, yeah. He didn't get it. But yeah, yes.
So, I'm listening to the whole thing. Basically, what you're saying is that though Jewish literary, this is the wrong term, I'm sure, in your term, but Jewish literary production, okay? Literary production by Jews, so far outstrips in its interest and its complexity the frame that literary critics.
That the Jewish literary, yes, I think that is correct.
And so, what could you, I mean, I'm just trying to think, and I agree with you, and I'm just a lowly historian, but.
I'm so sorry.
But it's true. I mean, in all sorts of ways, but can you give us an example of how a new criticism?
Yeah.
That's.
No, I think that's I have the privilege of being interested in really, and I mean this by not in its common sense, but it's like actual sense, my interest is like a critical literary study. Like I'm my project is a critical one, looking at how the field has formed itself, which allows me to suppress that question a little bit because I need the people I disagree with to make my living.
But you have tenure.
Put my feet up. No, right. I guess I would look at like the kind of literary study that I'm interested in would look at how texts fight against that predisposition. Like obviously, a text like, any of Philip Roth's like really canonized, but I mean, obviously these are about Jewish experience. They offer representations of Jewish experience. I just don't think that criticism needs to begin and end in stating the obvious, right? That's all. And I think that the field primarily, fundamentally, and like just the vast majority of what's produced in the field is really just an elaboration of that aboutness. And I think that there's more to go on. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks.